Welcome to HealthTech Remedy. This is the next installment of our bonus series on physician innovators, where we sit down with doctors who've stepped beyond the clinic to create new solutions, lead in biotech and health tech, and shape the future of care delivery. I'm Trevor Royce, joined as always by my co-hosts, Tim Showalter and Paul Gerard.
I'm Tim Showalter. In this series, we're exploring how physicians are applying their medical knowledge in unconventional ways, from building companies and products to driving change as investors and ecosystem builders.
And I'm Paul Gerard. We'll be learning how these physician innovators navigated their pivots, what inspired them, and what advice they have for others thinking beyond the bedside.
Today, we're thrilled to continue the series with Dr. Rebecca Mitchell. She's co-founder and managing director of Scrub Capital. She's a physician who has a unique and successful track record as a digital health product leader, one of the first actually, as well as an investor with a passion for improving the healthcare industry for patients and caregivers. Rebecca, thanks so much for speaking with us today.
My pleasure to be here.
Well, I think there's a lot to cover. We're talking about within a group. I think you've had such an interesting past, but I also think that your present is really fascinating for what you're up to with Scrub Capital. Can you maybe just before we hop in, everyone's going to want to hear about your background and sort of how you got into medicine and the sort of innovation story, but would love to hear first, just for our listeners, if you could explain what you're doing with Scrub Capital, what's the idea behind it, and what's the current status of that?
Great. So obviously my favorite topic these days alongside my family. So really the heart of the thesis of Scrub is that there are many, many early stage founders out there that have kind of seen the light and understand that they need to be working closely with clinicians who understand the practice of medicine, the science, they've done the frontline care, but who are also believers in technology and innovation, being the path out of our mess of the healthcare industry in 2025. I and my co-founders, Chrissy Farr and Dr. John Slotkin, have been really sitting as nodes in between these two communities, trying to find each other for years. And what had been a trickle for years had become really a tsunami of interest on both sides trying to find each other. And so we really said, how can we create a scalable vehicle to bring these groups together? And ultimately landed on the idea of a institutional VC firm for a couple reasons. One, there's lots of expert communities out there that are amazing. Often the price point doesn't work for the earliest stage startups and candidly for the clinicians and their time on the other side. There's lots of incredible syndicates and other communities like that where people are writing individual angel checks together out there. We love working with them. Unfortunately, as a company grows, those are usually wiped off the cap table as growth stage investors want to they call it cleaning up the cap table, which is a terrible term, but that's what they do. They simplify it really. And three, we really wanted to create a vehicle that could put very meaningful capital leverage behind the expertise and the networks and really the hearts of clinicians over time and these collaboration models with really early stage founders and their teams. And believe that venture, for all the mixed, results it's gotten to date when run by people who don't have this kind of background and expertise, really is an excellent way to become aligned with these companies and founders over the long term. And just structurally give clinicians exposure to the upside of these companies that they're spending their time and their energy on.
Thanks for that background. So I wanted to ask the big question here on what's your life story? How did you go from deciding you went to college at one point before you went to medical school? So what made you say time to go to medical school, become a doctor, and then ultimately pivot into a new direction?
Yeah, so we got to unfortunately go back even further than that to identify where all this came from. So I had the pleasure of growing up in a beautiful but quite rural and scarce in terms of the healthcare infrastructure part of the United States, northern Wisconsin. Parents were both in healthcare and human services in different ways throughout my childhood. And I was just seeing up close all of the cliches that we talk about all of the time and the limitations of rural healthcare in the United States. I think the hospital shut down several times while I was a kid, happened again recently. Thankfully, it's about to reopen again. People still have wait times that stretch into months, if not longer. My family still lives in the region. And so I was always really, really attuned to the reality that individual clinicians, by and large, incredible, talented people, but there are just places in the United States, and then later when I worked in global health became very clear the world, where the way that we are practicing the typical infrastructure for care just isn't working for those communities. And later learned that that was also the case in very urban areas, so it wasn't contained to those environments. But I have always really had a passion for thinking about how can we really bring the best of medical science, the best of care delivery to people really wherever they live in the world. Sadly, did have a couple personal experiences with family members that passed away due to completely avoidable medical errors and very overburdened systems. So that also definitely informed it. So I was always very set on a path into medical school and medicine, but knew that I wanted a huge portion of my career to be spent thinking about, how can we take, the science and pair it with really smart uses of technology and business model innovation and create different ways of bringing the best of the best, in terms of clinicians and expertise to people.
So it sounds like this idea of sort of innovating in healthcare has been with you for a long time. And can you talk a little bit about how you went through the process of training for medicine, which is a long road, and then being comfortable with kind of what your focus is today, which may not be as 100% patient facing as probably, I suspect, young Rebecca thought she would be when she started out on the medical school journey?
Yeah, no, definitely not the type of work I expected to be doing even in those early days when I knew I wanted to have an strong innovation thread to my work. So even before medical school, I had the really incredible experience to work with a nurse midwife at UC San Francisco who was really focused on addressing obstetric hemorrhage in some of the most remote, resource poor areas of the planet. And as all of you as physicians know, likely like in those places, a lot of women die prematurely or have really severe morbidities, when they have complications post-pregnancy, postpartum, and then there aren't blood products, there aren't materials around to treat them. They have to be transported off in hours, if not days. Really, really sad statistics. And she had done the work of finding a solution really with NASA, had worked alongside NASA, researchers, clinicians, and scientists on the ground in different places in the world to design a product and then collect the data to show that it was absolutely possible to stabilize these women and get them into environments where they could be expertly treated with the correct materials and the correct professionals around the table. And literally as a early 20-year-old, even before attending medical school, I was a little like peon on the team, right? Like helping with the research part of it, but I was seeing the power of this kind of cross-functional, cross-expert collaboration when people were really willing to think from first principles and be creative about how to solve this big entrenched clinical problem. And I was completely taken with being part of those teams and the solutions I saw coming there. And I quite literally watched women resuscitated from the brink of death and able to go back to their families. So it was a highly, highly impactful experience, and no software, right? In that at all, right? Really the heart of it, right? Was this kind of creativity when people from very different parts of the kind of planet and industries are working together. So I went to medical school out here in the San Francisco Bay Area at UC San Francisco. Loved medicine, loved all of my colleagues. I'd say about halfway through medical school, went through the brutal, brutal realization that the way I wanted to spend my time day to day was doing the kind of work that I'd been doing prior to medical school with that nurse midwife. And so really started working very, very part-time with a couple of different digital health companies in the Bay Area that were just starting at the time. Back then, most physicians were very oriented around implementing electronic medical records. And so those companies were willing to take a little medical student like me. They kind of couldn't get the real experts yet. It really just confirmed for me that the work I loved to do was actually bringing together people like yourself and helping really like engineers and data science and commercialization experts figure out how to work as partners with people that understood the medicine and the science and had real frontline patient experience. So I finished medical school, but I will tell you it was the most difficult transition I've experienced in my life, owning that was the work I was supposed to be doing when it was so different, not only from what I expected, but also what everybody was screaming in my face was expected of me. I remember I submitted like the match list. And at some point, I very clearly remember like sitting sobbing on the stairway in my apartment, just knowing in my heart and in my gut that I was supposed to be pursuing this other path for how I was going to have impact in medicine. And, it was it was a really challenging time, just to be completely honest. And I hear a lot of people even now when I'd say medicine is as a whole is much more supportive of people having diverse career paths, nonlinear career paths, incorporating some of this work part or even full time into their career. Even now, people still struggle with this and talk about it behind closed doors and increasingly on social media. So I will say for all the listeners, like always happy to have this conversation if that's a period that you are working through, because it is very, very real and still very hard. But anyway, so I finished medical school, having made that decision, and then spent the next 15 years doing product work, doing ops work, doing go-to-market leadership work at different companies. They all really shared a similar thread, which is how do we bring expertise out of the four walls of clinics and health systems to people in their day-to-day lives in terms and using methods that fit into their daily lives and kept them engaged in their health over the long term. So just a couple examples, had the fortune to partner with Kaiser Permanente at a company called Validic and helping to design some of their early remote patient monitoring programs, people living with chronic conditions. I will note that project actually came out of a physician in one of the regions who'd invented it in the first place. So to give credit where credit's due, right? It was very much like a physician-led innovation that we then partnered with them to scale up. Still in use today. In fact, I have a few family members that use the program, which is really cool. And then Livongo was probably the brand name people are most familiar with, but joined that company fairly early when we were one chronic condition, diabetes, and one market employer. And then was part of the product team as a leader, figuring out how to expand to multiple conditions, because of course people have, multiple chronic conditions usually, and how we were going to reach people who had their, healthcare covered through lots of different market segments, not just their employer over time. And was with them through their IPO, the acquisition with Teladoc. Ultimately, at the end of my time there, I was responsible for product lines that were treating 10 million patients a year. And you can say what you will, right, about how the stock price has done what it's done as everyone has come to terms with how we should actually value services businesses. But I guess when I reflect on the whole situation, I never present myself, right, as a practicing physician in the trenches of a hospital or something like that. But I do very much feel that I have practiced a version of medicine across my career, because I absolutely thought about all of those millions of people as my patients and felt intensely, intensely responsible for them in the same way that I did way back in medical school, right? When I was just a little med student running alongside the rest of the team.
That's a fantastic narrative, and I love the way you framed it. It just reminded me of something I saw on Twitter the other day, a popular follow called Sahil Bloom, I think is his name, where he said, quote, "It's perfectly okay to live a life that looks confusing to others." And I think about that all the time in medicine, because there's so much peer pressure in medicine to, take that traditional path. But when you reflect on your journey and the just incredible impact that you've had of building these services to access patients remotely, and just the many hundreds of thousands, if not millions of patients you've been able to truly impact through this industry path, I think that's often underappreciated.
Yeah, I mean, I just think if you think about like the clinical impact, when you're in medical school, you think about you want to take care of your community. You basically took on this many millions of patients in your community that you're taking care of. And it's pretty remarkable to see that. The other thing that I think is fascinating is you hear these stories in health technology of these crystallized, stubborn clinicians who join the teams, and they're often at odds within technology. But when you think about a product manager, someone who's really in charge of a innovative product, you think about empathy and open-mindedness and sourcing feedback and putting it all together. And it seems like as a clinician who's in that role, you're bringing something really special to the technology and to the overall team. So I'm curious, you've had a lot of experiences like after medical school and along the way. Was there like one particular experience that was like your textbook or your boot camp for how to be a product leader in that role and how to be effective? Like, what do you attribute your success to primarily?
Oh, sure. So I would say the secret sauce that always predictably led to success in terms of the product actually, working in terms of clinical outcomes, its commercial success, so supporting the business to be really successful. It's very similar to the approach we've taken at Scrub, actually. And that is you absolutely, I was never the person in the team that was like, I'm speaking for all the physicians in medicine. Like that was not my role, right? It was as like the leader bringing together the right people around the table and getting them to work well together towards a shared goal. It was always when you could find a clinician, and I use the word clinician intentionally, right? Sometimes it's not always the physician is the right person for the role. Could be a nurse, could be PTOT, like whatever it is. Ensuring that they had an equal seat at the table alongside those with other areas of expertise, and really ensuring the team culturally knew how to work together, like setting clear processes so people could engage, right? And more than anything, really getting everybody captured around that table, hearts and minds in a sense of like ownership, right? In what they were building. I think we like way too often, especially in the clinician world, like put people in silos where it's like, I'm only responsible for like the quality element of this or the clinical outcomes perspective on this. When you free people to see the whole picture and sit alongside others, right, that can, you know, build and experiment with them, you absolutely unlock magic, not only in the clinicians, but also in everybody else in that shared experience. I will say, Livongo is so consistently framed as a company that, it was successful because we had an amazing sales team. It was successful because of Glenn Tolman. Absolutely true. The and to that is never spoken about is that it was one of the highest functioning partnerships between like clinicians in that business, both on the product team, also in the CMOs group, and in sales that I've ever experienced. And, it really came from the top where we had this chief medical officer who then became the president, Dr. Jenny Schneider, who absolutely got it, right? And she created that culture and that way of working as a business very, very early on in its life cycle. So I really do wish more people understood that about the business because it is one of the things absolutely worth emulating.
That's remarkable. Yeah, it seems like if you can get everyone working together, so like the clinicians are thinking like product leads and business managers and thinking about, the commercial, longevity of the program, and you can get the technical people thinking about the clinical problems, and everyone's empathetic and working together. It just, it's amazing
Absolutely.
in terms of the innovation.
I think one of the grossest things that we do, honestly, is characterizing people as either clinical or business people in companies and in the world. Like, how many business people do you know working in healthcare that are like, oh, I don't really actually care about people getting healthier, or like they would work in a different industry. Like, let's be real, right? Like, this is not the industry to go into if you don't care about those things.
100%. Well, I'm curious, like with that in mind, though, I'm curious if you're sort of explaining to maybe someone who's not in healthcare, or just a random person seated on the airplane next to you, about the value add for having clinicians involved in diligence and sort of helping advise founders within Scrub Capital. I think of all these buckets, like understanding how the health system works, understanding how reimbursement incentives can affect prescribing behavior, like all these different aspects where clinicians might have insights. Like, what do you view as the biggest value add for the composition of investors and insights that Scrub Capital offers?
Yeah. So first of all, I will give some credit where credit is due. You know who understands this better than anybody? The founders. Like, I can't tell you, like this whole firm was like negative 10 days old, and we had people like busting down our door, so excited that something now existed where they could have a scalable, consistent way of interacting with people that we now have in the community. So the people who don't get it, it's often surprising, to be quite but there's definitely not people building the companies, right? They wisened up. So a couple of things, one of the things we knew was really important from day one in building Scrub was to have a large, extremely diverse community of clinicians. In the same way that you need a care team that has different specialties within it, right? Like different levels of, different focus areas of training, levels of training. The same thing is true in this community we've built to make it really effective for collaborating with founders. So there's around 850 of them now, all over the country. They represent all different kind of specialties and subspecialties. We have physicians, we have nurses, we have NPs, we have PT, OT, dentists, pharmacists, right? Like, very intentional, diverse group. Around a third of them are also current founders or past founders themselves. A large portion of them are leaders or recent leaders at major health systems. A large portion of them, run big private practice groups. So there's a real wealth of both perspectives and real hand-on experience building businesses, right, in the group. And so what the community can offer can be quite specific to the given company. And often people think that we're only looking at and investing in companies that are quite, literally like workflow products of physicians. That is absolutely not true. Like, we have the group to assess a company serving any market segment, plans, pharma, employer, yes, health systems, private practice groups. We have people that can help you with recruiting your first CMO, building your first medical advisory board, evaluating and giving feedback on how you're thinking about, building a good kind of bolus of like research to support your innovation. We have people that have incredible networks that can open doors for you in different kind of market channels. On that note, one of the really important beliefs that we have is like, not only are we going to see better companies and make better decisions when it comes to investing as a firm, if we have clinicians really involved in that process. We have like 40 clinicians involved in every single investment we make, for what it's worth. So lots of engagement. We also very much believe that when it is incredibly transparent to the entire community, why we are investing in the companies we're investing in, how their peers, even if they weren't part of the process, like had input into that situation, the introductions that are made and the willingness to pick up a call is completely different than if it's somebody who's just in a VC's Rolodex, like, oh, sure, like I'll do this as a favor to this fancy VC because like maybe someday, right? Like I'll get something out of it, or they're a friend. People are doing these things because they really believe in the companies and the people building these companies, right? Like the hearts and the minds. And for some of them who are also LPs, the wallets are all aligned and wanting to make these businesses and people successful.
Let me just pivot a little bit to talking about what happens when when a company comes to you and is looking for funding. I guess, are you willing to share sort of target check size that you write? Sort of size of company and maybe how you interact with some of the other potential investors in a company.
Yeah. So answer first, kind of what we do and don't invest in is a fund one. And this will of course evolve over time as we grow. So in fund one, we're very focused on pre-seed through Series A, although seed stage companies really are our sweet spot. We're writing a couple $100,000 checks in fund one. So we're really a strategic participant on the cap table, which makes it very friendly for other VCs, right, that are leading the rounds to reach out and pull us in, which is increasingly, what's happening with some of the really, really good companies that maybe aren't even coming to market. We are very intentionally quite diverse in where we invest within healthcare. Really, the only things that we won't invest in are areas where it's so time and capital intensive that it just doesn't make sense for a 10-year fund writing a couple $100K checks. That is both because we believe we can, because of a diverse, amazing group working with us to see and select these companies and support them. It's also because we believe you really have to be as an early stage investor to be successful. As all of us know, there's different categories that go in and out of favor every couple of years. And we don't control the larger market when our companies are trying to exit. So we want to ensure, right, we have that diversification of different themes. Beyond that, a couple of really important things to know about the experience of, sharing an opportunity with us. One, we've very intentionally made ourselves easy to find, and for anybody who has an idea to share that idea with us. We have a forum you can fill out, and every single company that sends something is looked at seriously by one of the general partners on the team, myself, John Slotkin, or Chrissy Farr. So it's very much not a situation where we're just putting up a website with no email and then we have to waste a bunch of time trying to find a warm introduction to us. We don't believe in that. As GP is screening it initially for the kind of classic quality indicators of a deal, ensuring it, fits the parameters I just described. The other piece of it we're screening for, which is different than many firms, we need to see a path to not only being successful financially, potentially, if we invested in this business. We also really need to believe that it's worth spending our time and our capital on in terms of this potential impact on human health and the whole industry. So we're not impact investors. I wouldn't call us that, but there very much is an and to our need for it to be able to show financial returns. And then it gets into the really exciting, unique part. So we bring the companies that make it through that initial gauntlet in what we call our community pitch. And that's where we have around 30 to 40 clinicians from the larger community joining and spending around an hour with those founders and whoever else they're going to bring in from their early team. And it really is a professional investment pitch. It's not just talking about, kind of the clinical aspects of the companies. And then the founders and the community members are in conversation for a good portion. And it ends up being, both an opportunity for that group to ask some really, really good questions, which, again, they're not usually just clinical, right? It's all across kind of the business and the way they're building it and the opportunity in the round. But it's also just as much a taste of the kind of, advising and support the founder would get in working with our community. And I'll say consistently, founders that make it to that community pitch level and go through it often say, Rebecca, we would do this and pay you for this, like independent of your ability to write a check. Like it is just so valuable interfacing with these people, even if it's for, only an hour. And then we take those perspectives that are coming in after that community pitch and decide whether or not we're going to pursue diligence with the company, are then putting together, a much smaller group of people, including clinicians from the community, relative to the questions we're going to ask. And then ultimately, we do have an investment committee that's making the final call. We believe that consensus doesn't tend to lead to good outcomes in venture investing, right? but it's very, very transparent and clear how we've used those perspectives from the larger community in driving the decision.
Just a quick sort of practical follow-up question on that. Do you include biotech or drug development in your thesis, or is that outside of what you guys focus on?
We are not doing drug development. We'll do some biotech. And again, it's really about, if this is going to take like 20 years to exit and be so capital intensive that like we're going to get completely washed out. That's more what we're looking at rather than being super strict about a specific category. So unfortunately, drug development generally no, but there is some flex in biotech. And we have invested in companies that I'd consider biotech. Spark Spine is an example. And there's one that we've committed to, but I can't talk about out loud, both biotech companies.
Fantastic. Yeah, I guess as we start to close out, one question we like to ask everyone that comes on the innovation and physician innovator side of things is, are there any advice that you have for the many listeners hearing your story as they think about sort of alternative paths or ways to bring their impact beyond the bedside?
I would say the most fulfilled, often impactful people I know in medicine are the ones that have been willing to take the nonlinear path and be really, really honest about their unique skills, what gives them energy, and the time that we are living in, right? So it's a really interesting time. One. And so look, it's uncomfortable, especially if you've, grown up in the world of medicine, but like lean into that. There's never been a better time, right? To be creative and take some risks in your career. And then second, it does speak to the risk part of this. I'm not the first person to say this, right? I'll be far from the last, but you do have to embrace some level of risk in taking a nonlinear path or starting a company or whatever it is. And that's something that it's worth getting comfortable with earlier on in your career if you can. But I think people regularly under-index on the risk of, I guess, taking a road that should be traveled and the great things that could happen in your life and for your patients and the larger world.
Yeah, very well said. And kind of to tie it all together and wrap that up, I'm a true believer in the compounding of knowledge. And it's very clear how your experiences have very clearly led you to the next, and to really set yourself up for Scrub Capital is a very unique fund and a way to increase your impact.
Appreciate that. It's a real honor to be able to run this fund. Best job I've ever had.
Well, thank you, Dr. Mitchell, for joining us. It's been great to hear your story. And that'll do it for this episode of HealthTech Remedy. Be sure to subscribe and follow us on your favorite podcast platform. And if you know any physician innovators who would enjoy being interviewed and be a part of this, give us a message and we'd love to hear their story. Thanks so much.